I think people tend to walk into the successful chapter that a person's life is on and just assume that that's been their entire story. And I think for too many of us, we've been talking about this all week. We're comparing our lives in many ways, our reality, to someone else's fiction because we assume that what they demonstrate is all that there ever was. But what I've discovered is that we all have a story. And until we're willing to be vulnerable and share the truth of our story, there are so many people that assume that their lives are insufficient by comparison with ours. And so for me, I released my memoir earlier this year in January, a book called Success from the Inside Out. And, for years, people had been asking, hey, will you mentor me? Will you teach me how to get ahead in my career? Will you teach me how to build a business? And that's because that's all they ever knew of me. But I released this book because I wanted people to really have the whole story. And so I talked about how I grew up in a home where my mother didn't want to have children. I was an only child. She was physically, verbally, emotionally, psychologically abusive to me. She allowed her boyfriend to sexually abuse me. As a matter of fact, he started when I was 5, and I worked up the courage to tell her what he was doing when I was about 7. And she had him arrested, and I thought it was over. But on the day of his release from jail, she took me with her to pick him up and brought him back home. And the abuse resumed again. And, I would go to school and I would act out at school, and I got called all these names. You're a problem child. You're never going to be anything. And nobody ever asked me why. Like, nobody ever asked me to tell my story. People made up their own version of my story based on my behavior. And I think I learned at that early age that, if you don't own your story, somebody else will write it for you. And it very well may not be true. It may not be accurate. But I think that the challenge for us is we oftentimes live in fear. We think, well, what will they think about me if they knew this part of me? How will they look at me differently if they knew what I had done or what I had been through? And what we fail to realize is that God wastes nothing. There is no part of your story that is accidental, that somehow doesn't matter. What I believe to be true is that there are people in this world who are waiting to hear your story in order to know that they are not defective. I think what the enemy tries to do is he tries to isolate us. He tries to make us believe that we're the only one. And as long as we keep our stories to ourselves, then that lie can run marathons. But when we actually open our mouths and say, no, that happened to me too. But let me tell you how powerful God is to redeem that thing that you may think is an entire deal breaker. I can show you how God can even use that thing. And what I discovered when I was on my book tour earlier this year, there were so many people who came out to the events and they said, you know what, that happened to me too. And I've never told anyone. And I'm talking about people who are very successful, high up in business, people who were high up in ministries that you would never think, and not just women, I'm talking about men too, who would pull me to the side and say, I've never told anyone my story. And that has given me a mandate. And I encourage everyone to please share the good work that God has done in your life. We are not all born perfect. We are not all born saved. There are things in our past that we may not be proud of that were done to us or things that we did. And yet, God has the power to redeem that thing. The last thing I'll say is, when I was preparing my book, God gave me an analogy. He said, how does mold grow? And I said, well, it tends to grow in dark, damp places. And he said, exactly. He said, mold grows in dark, damp places. But when you expose it to the light, it has to die. And our God is the light of the world. And that's why I believe he wants us to just be honest and be vulnerable. And you will discover that you're not alone. I feel like and I'm sensing in my spirit that there are people watching who are just like, yeah, I have a story to tell. But, if I say it, people will think differently of me. They will look down on me. They will think that I'm damaged goods. And I got to be honest with you. You are not put on earth to be perceived as pristine. You are put on earth to point people to the cross. And the only way to do that is to demonstrate God's power to redeem. And there are some people, this is the truth. There are some people who will point their finger at you and they'll judge you. But I have found it to be the case that the people who tend to judge the harshest are the ones who are guilty of what they're judging you for. So don't take it personally. Sometimes we don't know how to sit in our own guilt. And this is also why Jesus came to relieve us from guilt. He came to relieve us from shame. But there are some people who can't even forgive themselves, even though the Father has already done so. And as a result, we try to hold over each other that which we are guilty of. I want to encourage you, though, don't allow the enemy to rob you of your purpose. Whatever has happened to you in your past, your brokenness is not your burden, it's your ministry. That abortion that you had, that's a ministry to others who have had abortions. That divorce that you had, that is a ministry to others who are divorced. The bankruptcy is a ministry to others who were bankrupt. The drug addiction, that's a ministry to others who are struggling. And God wants to use all parts of you, the cracks, the crevices, the broken pieces. He wants to use it all for his glory. The Bible tells us that the stone that the builders rejected became the chief cornerstone, because that's the God that we serve.
I hope you enjoyed this video. Subscribe today and you'll never miss a new upload.
And don't forget to check out our Better Together shop. Thanks for being a part of our community.